This discussion provides a broad statement on the text from a postmodern point of view. My point of view is that any text is a postmodern text in the sense that there is a point of view hidden within the text, and it is for us as readers to discover that point of view. A writer cannot place himself objectively outside the text. He or she is always already a part of the text or a part of the context. She has to have a point of view. I have tried to maintain a point of view which is that any text can be a topic for the postmodern critic. It could be Darwin's Origin of Species or the Gospel of St. John. It does not matter because both are talking about origins, the beginnings, or what is assumed to have happened at some point in time. In a subtle way, both are involved in the use of language, and both can be studied from a postmodern point of view. A text in quotes called language. In other words, I equated the idea of language with that of a text, which means that language is the context that we live in and that we work in and in which we express ourselves. Okay? There are two ways of posing the statement, what is a text? Because by its very nature, when I say what is a text, I also mean what is a context. So there is a perspective within the statement. So either I can ask it as a question or either I can exclaim it. But either way, I have to make all the gestures necessary for the statement. So in other words, even a simple statement like what is a text acquires the scope of a theater and a performance. So every statement is a performance. It's not a simple utterance. It's something that happens in our minds and something we prepare ourselves towards. For instance, I'm reading a book describing European history from the Renaissance to the present. So in a straightforward manner, the book tells me about Renaissance as a rebirth in art and science that occurred in Europe owing to the achievements of creative artists or scientists or thinkers such as Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Shakespeare, Marlowe, etc. But there is something that the book will not talk about. For example, it will not talk about women, it won't talk about children, it won't talk about homosexuals, it won't talk about slaves. So history is considered from distinct points of origin, that this author is the creator of this text. But that's not the case. All works of art are in some sense collective achievements, but that's not what the text will say. So history itself is not seen as a point of view, one among many others. That's the contention that I'm trying to make. That even what we call history is from the point of view of one particular writer or author. Its claims to universality are deeply problematic. A simple, spontaneous response to the question, who is Derrida, would be an author of books, but that is something even Derrida would refuse. I'll tell you why. Because the distinction is between a book and a text. When I say book, I'm referring to this closed entity. But when I say text, I'm talking about the words on the page. And words on the page will never be constant. They're constantly interpreting and reinterpreting themselves depending on the experience of the reader. So in that sense, a text is not the same as the book. A text is constantly open to interpretations. So the reader knows that words are not natural to her being, but she is born into the social space of language. In fact, even before she is born, the reader or writer is assigned a role. She is a child, girl, citizen, prince, or beggar. This implies that there are certain sets of functional definitions that existed even before the reader or writer came of age. So you already had a role before you were born. So there is a framework into which you are born. So your presence or your arrival into the world is not natural. We enter this social space, we are just filling a role, you see. So in that sense, language is the text that we use in order to speak of definitions. So we enter the space of language, a language that is always already there, you see, and in which we have to recreate ourselves. The postmodern text. But you see, already I'm being ironic because I equated text with language in the previous module. So in saying that that I'm going to talk about the postmodern text, I only mean to say that I will be talking about language or the use of language or how writers arrive at definitions. In fact, a writer is born into various definitions or simultaneously language or the text. In the very act of using the word language, there is a definition operating between the writer and the reader. So this definition is constantly changing, but it is there. How does it exist in terms of perspectives? So the writer arrives with a perspective and the reader arrives with a perspective, by which I mean that two different experiences of reality come together. Another metaphor for language or the text is a tool. I made this distinction between a tool and an instrument. And I said that instrument is something that is done with an end in view, whereas a tool is more multifaceted or more multidimensional. You see? So while an author uses instrument, a writer uses tools. So my point is that authors tend to control the meaning of a text, you see? Whereas writers do not. They open the space of the text for interpretation or for the reader's experience of reality. So, you see, I used Derrida as the basis of my argument. And this is from one of Derrida's books, Spurs, in which he is talking about Nietzsche. And he says Nietzsche's style is like a woman, he says. Nietzsche's style defies a reading that attempts to give Nietzsche a central meaning, one that attempts to see him as an author than as a writer. So in other words, Nietzsche is more a writer who allows himself to be interpreted in many ways rather than just an author. So as a writer, Nietzsche poses like a hysterical woman that he attempts to emulate in his style. You see, what Derrida is attempting to do is to problematize the notion of style and the notion of author as an authority figure who controls the meanings of the text. So when he says that Nietzsche's style is like a woman, he means to say that Nietzsche is not this patriarchal philosopher that we assume him to be, but there is a different kind of reading for Nietzsche. So the text never discloses a unified truth about itself. The text is constantly challenging the reader's imagination. It constantly forces the reader to think about him or herself in new ways or in more ways than one. So the postmodern imagination is neither ahistorical nor transhistorical. So it does not ignore history, but at the same time it does not attempt to transcend history. It's somewhere in between. History is just another text that the postmodernist uses in disruptive ways, in challenging ways, to arrive at alternate readings or different kinds of readings that visualize history more in terms of a collage that brings together a diverse sets of images. So different images are put together. So different perspectives or different points of view come together in order for us to understand history. What is a text or who is a postmodernist? There is something relative to this question. You see, either way we arrive at a definition, and definitions are by their very nature restrictive or a set of guidelines for us to understand what we intend to say, you see. So the point is that the absence of guidelines does not mean that the postmodernist is a nihilist and the text is nothing, you see. So in other words, we accept the guidelines, we accept definitions, but the only thing we challenge is the absolute nature of definitions. you see? Because all definitions are in some sense open-ended, and the creative interpretation of the reader is important here. Texts and contexts. Look, the moment I equated language with a text, I also consciously or unconsciously implied that we are talking about contexts, whether they are social, political, or economic. But my point is that all these contexts are contained within the use of language, or how we use language. That's what it's all about. So discourse, I gave the name of discourse to say that it is just an organization of science. So our use of language revolves around how we organize words, or what we call science. Different discourses organizes the science in different ways to suit their interests. For example, a word in computer science can be used in other genre or in other disciplines. But the usage of the word will change the meaning of the word. The word may be the same, but owing to the usage, it changes completely. I can give you countless examples. The word life, for example. For a biologist, life means something else. For a doctor, life means something else. For a literary artist, life means something else. For a painter, life means something else. But the word is the same, it's life. We say that's life. But the meaning is not that obvious. We have to figure out the usage or the context in which the meaning is used. And I have before me a brief text of automata theory that I will reproduce in its original version, written in a technical style as well as in a literary manner. What I did is very simple. You see, I took this paragraph called context-free languages and pushed down automata, and I merely changed the form, the format, or just the writing, how we write it. You see? So let me read it for you. Context-free languages and push down automata. We want to go beyond regular languages in the finite automata that recognize them to larger classes of languages and machines. In this chapter, we will also study the context-free languages and the push down automata that recognize them. We will also look at some classical parsing methods for context-free languages. This is a very technical statement from a computer science textbook. But what I did is, I just changed the form, the kind of spaces that we use to define a poem, for example. I changed it and gave it the form of a poem, just for the sake of argument. And I put this in italics, context-free languages and push down automata, as the title. And I tried to produce some kind of a rhythm. We want to go beyond regular languages and the finite automata that recognize them to larger classes of languages and machines. In this chapter, we'll study the context-free languages and the push-down automata that recognize them. We will also look at some classical parsing methods for context-free languages. So my point is very simple, that a simple rearrangement of spaces can make all the difference of the world. So that space is vital to our understanding of the text, because even our context is about spaces. When we say society, we mean social space. When we say economy, we are talking about economic space, the space in which we live and we work in. Or when we say politics, we mean political spaces. So the idea of the space is built into our use of language, and that is something that the postmodernist understands. So he or she analyzes these spaces or goes into how these spaces are arranged, because it is those spaces between the words that we see, that it is those spaces that define meaning. Do they do it in a manifest way or a clear way? That's not the point. The point is that they do it. Somewhere at the back of the line that we read, there is a space that is waiting to open itself. So our understanding of space gives a totally different understanding of the text. When we talk about this room, we are talking about space, you see. We are not talking merely about the walls of this room, you see. Because it is the space that defines the walls of this room. So a text is something like that. So it is not just about what appears to on the page, you see. History and the postmodern. Is the postmodernist as old as history? What I'm trying to say is, where can we really identify the beginnings of postmodernism? Because we began by saying that anything is a text, or the postmodernist can look anywhere for his or her understanding, interpretation, you see. They don't have to just locate themselves in the present. Like Derrida, for example, does, you see, he goes into the past and he goes into the future, but he treats them within the context of the present. That's the point here, you see. In a broad sense, the postmodernist is as old as history, because alternate writers always existed as women or as slaves or as Jews, you see. So those who were discriminated were always writing from the margins. They may not have appeared at the center of the text, but somewhere they were there at the borders, you see. Their situation was a context that the great authors pushed to the borders of their texts. So somehow when we read even older texts, somewhere within that space of the text, within the social space of the text, we realize that there is something that is not spoken about. And that's where we arrive at a postmodern reading of the text, you know. Because we are trying to bring the margin to the center. We are trying to bring that which has not spoken about, or that which has been ignored, into the purview of the present, you know. So for example, this is from Plato's Phaedo. This is his last dying discourse. There is a passage on Xanthippe, the wife of Socrates, and in interesting ways Xanthippe is a postmodern subject. So this is a quote, you know, let me read it for you, you see. When we went inside, we found Socrates released from his chains, and Xanthippe, you know her, sitting by him with the little boy on her knee. As soon as Xanthippe saw us, she broke out into the sort of remark that you would expect from a woman, you know. Oh Socrates, this is the last time that you and your friends will be able to talk together. Socrates looked at Crito. Crito, he said, someone had better take her home. Some of Crito's servants led her away crying hysterically. You see, the text doesn't say much, you know. I mean, the hero of the text or the protagonist of this dialogue is Socrates, you see, needless to say, you see. But at the border or at the margin of the text is Xanthippe, you know, you see, who has come down in history as the shrewish wife, and as a wife that doesn't befit to be a philosopher as great as Socrates, you see. But you know her. Who knows Xanthippe except as the wife of Socrates, the father of rationalism, you know. So was he a considerate father to his own son, the little boy? There is no evidence of it in the above quotation. So what is it that Phaedo expects from a woman? What is it that Phaedo expects of a woman that is so natural to her being? Dramatics, hysteria and tears, which belong to her condition, and in Xanthippe's case as the wife of Socrates. So the point I'm trying to ask is, you see, was Socrates a good father to his son? Was he a good husband? You see, these are non-issues as far as Plato is concerned. But from a postmodern perspective, we go into the limitations of Socrates' personal life. So he may have been the father of rationalism, but don't forget, he failed at the level of familial obligations. So you see, the postmodernity lies in this, that we show his limitations. So he is not merely this great protagonist of rationalism, because what he is not is that he fails in many ways as a person or as a human being. So postmodernity attempts to locate these failures in this so-called great men. You see? So that's where we try to relate history with the postmodern subject. The metaphor of the footnote. So to identify the margin, I use the footnote as a metaphor to speak about that which is excluded or that which is not included in a mainstream reading of the text. Because postmodernism attempts to go into these footnotes of history. In this instance, the postmodern text can be seen as a series of footnotes, because we are constantly attempting to find that which is not spoken about. And because something is not spoken about, it does not mean it does not exist. So that is where the footnote comes into play. The footnote stands outside the text, but is also a commentary on the text. It throws light on the text. So if I have to make a further explanation, I use the footnote. But maybe as a reader, I don't bother to look further. So similarly, in my reading of history, I may just look at certain facts, but I may not look into the entire text. So that's important, you see. But when we go into the footnotes or into the margins or into the background, we get a different understanding of the text. The metaphor of the footnote can be used to create an imaginative reconstruction of events. So in other words, what is missing in history, these missing elements, we can bring them into the fore. We can bring them into the light. So a book written under British colonialism, for example, it can only make sense to us when we think of what Indians went through under British rule. We cannot read a book that was written in a colonial period and pretend that this book perfectly reflects that period. It does not. Obviously, it excludes or ignores the life of the colonized. You see, that is true of all literature that we study in a colonial framework. You see, that it is always excluding somebody, and in this case, the colonized. You see. So I went on to show that how the idea of the black or the idea of blackness has always been excluded from history, because it is something that white Europeans identified with the colonized or with the suppressed. You see. And I gave examples from these sonneteers of the Renaissance. You see, Shakespeare's greatness is that he can subvert conventions. So he shows that there is something more to this idea of blackness than just what is obvious. And Shakespeare says from one of his sonnets, in the old age, black was not counted fair. This is sonnet 127. You see, in Western thought, black corresponds to the negative night, darkness, evil, sin and death, hell being a place of eternal darkness. So hell is this dark place, no one goes there, no one is supposed to go there, you see. So Shakespeare inverts an ideology permeating the writings of every other major writer in the West, beginning with Plato, you see. And let me give you a few quotes from the Renaissance sonneteers. O my black soul, now thou art summoned by sickness, death's herald and champion, but black sin hath betrayed to endless night. This is done from the Holy Sonnets. You see? And again Shakespeare. In the old age, black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. Sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower. My mistress' eyes are raven black, her eyes so suited, and they mourners seem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says, beauty should look so, you see. So in endowing black with sexual beauty, Shakespeare fouls the fair and fairs the foul, you see. This supports the idea of a footnote that becomes the basis of an alternate writing for Shakespeare. Language comes from a social space, it comes from a context, and writers are merely users of those spaces. The spaces of the text. as you would expect it to be in. So a postmodern discourse of history would open itself to language theory and comparative criticism rather than strictly abiding by a positivist reading of the text. When I say positivist reading, it means that I just go by what the author is saying. I am not creatively putting myself into the text. My posing the statement is a culture-specific act related to my positioning as a subject fixed in a geographical space, that is India in this context. So I inhabit this geographical space, and this history of this nation is bound to be dramatized within every statement that I make. The food I eat, what are the thoughts I think, the languages that I use, and so on and so forth. You see. To illustrate my point, I would like to imagine that the text has two different kinds of spaces. One is an inertial space. That means a space that kind of centers itself within. But another is a dynamic space, a space that opens itself to multiple readings or different readings based on individual experiences of reality. You see? So the inertial space is the discourse of history in search of the truth. That means the idea that the text has only one truth to tell us, and the truth is what the author imagines or thinks or assumes about a subject. But another kind of reading is where there are diverse truths or diverse explanations for one particular event. You see? So the dynamic space of language opens the text to multiple uses or multiple ways of looking at the text. You see? Like the different senses, there are different isms, approaches and disciplines that can be brought together. You see, the beauty of the postmodern reading of the text is that, for example, in disciplines such as history or even economics, which we assume to be very scientific, even there is a perspective, you see. The economist is not a completely innocent figure, you see. He or she brings his worldview into play, you see. In the traditional or conventional reading of the text, we only go by one attempt or one reading, one central kind of meaning that we are looking for. So if I told you, tell me the summary of this text, you would write it in one paragraph to tell me what this author is saying about this particular subject. But in a postmodern reading of the text, whatever the textbook may be, whether it's economics, whether it's history, or whether it's anthropology or sociology or philosophy or whatever you say, that there are always spaces for multiple readings of the text. So does this discussion finally answer the statement, what is the text? At least if it must end with a question or an exclamation. It does not, you see. Because either way, we have to have some set of assumptions to say why this is a question mark or why this is an exclamation. You see? Either way, there is an expectation built, you see. So am I expecting an answer from you, or am I just making a statement, you see, in order to be rhetorical? That's precisely the point of postmodernism, which is that any response is bound to be, at best, a partial one. You see? The text is an infinite series of other texts. So within one text, there is always another text, and within that text, there is another text. It's like the Russian Matryoshka doll. You see? So we are looking for a doll within a doll within a doll. But where does the doll end? Where does meaning finally conclude? That's not the point, you see. Because once you start looking for a meaning that concludes, you miss the whole point, which is that there is no conclusion. So in that sense, different generations of readers, different, specialists in different disciplines will have their own reading or understanding of reality. And we have to accept their reading for what it is. We cannot dismiss any reading to say that this is the correct reading and that's not the correct reading. Because what is right and wrong is always relative from a postmodern perspective. This does not mean that every statement that you make, I kind of deconstruct or tend to say that this is not the case. You see, in a court of law, for example, we accept some evidence as real and some as not real. You see? But my point is, only as long as we are aware that we cannot give any meaning in absolute sense, we are in a safe situation. Because it means that we create space for other kinds of reading. You see? So there is no single text, but a chain of texts linked together as science. You see? So my point is that there are multiple texts, even in what looks like a single text. Thank you very much.